Hi, my name is Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of the public policy group America's Survival. We examine terrorism and related issues. I'm joined today by Max Noel, a former FBI agent for 31 years, and Larry Grathwohl, a former FBI informant. On this day, 9/11, we're coming to you from San Francisco to discuss a wave of terrorism that occurred decades ago. It was a period of terrorism and revolutionary violence on American soil back in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. This included literally hundreds of bombings and attacks on police that took the lives of police officers. And one of these cases in particular we're going to get into in some detail, and that involved the murder of San Francisco Police Sergeant Brian V. McDonald, which remains officially unsolved 40 years after it occurred on February 16, 1970. Now, my guests today include Max Noel, who was an FBI agent, highly decorated for 31 years. He was a criminal investigator in the San Francisco division of the FBI, working on several high-profile FBI investigations and cases. He was also a member and supervisor of the Unabomb task force that arrested Unabomber Theodore Kaczynski after his 18-year spree of terrorist bombings. Max Noel also investigated the Weather Underground. He was a member of the Weatherman Task Force in San Francisco and helped locate the Pine Street bomb factory maintained by the Weather Underground. We're going to talk about that bomb factory in one of our videos. That is a bomb factory where the fingerprints of leading members of the Weather Underground, including Bill Ayers, were found. We are going to take you inside that bomb factory, showing you pictures of the bomb-making materials and communist Marxist-Leninist literature that were found there. Max, when we look back at this period of time, explain from your perspective as an FBI agent at the time what you were looking at, what you were facing.
Well, FBI didn't interrupt their normal investigative activities because of the large amount of what I would consider to be urban guerrilla warfare going on, but it certainly was a distraction as a young agent working. And people today have tended to forget what a dangerous time the late 60s and the early 70s in particular were for law enforcement officials, specifically local law enforcement officials. In 1972, for instance, there were over 1,900 bombings domestically in the United States. In 1971, there were all kinds of bombings and attacks on police officers, police stations, government buildings, and so forth. So, being a young agent at that time in San Francisco, who was spending most of his time, or a good deal of his time, working in the Haight-Ashbury and in amongst the counterculture people, we were very aware of the dangers involved for local law enforcement, and that's why the killing, the bombing at the Park Police Station was very near and dear to me as an FBI agent. I was in the Parks Police Station frequently during that particular period of time.
And that's the bombing that took the life of Sergeant McDonald. Now, looking back on it as a former agent at that time, what's your reaction to the fact that members of the Weather Underground, many of them basically got off? Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn not only went free, but they became, quote, respected college professors, and yet top officials of the FBI ended up being prosecuted for violating their rights.
Well, I think that's always bothered all of us over the years. For them to have been freed on what most of us consider to be technicalities, most FBI agents that worked in that time, I don't believe, thought it was correct. The fact that three of our leaders were convicted of crimes for the actions that they were authorizing. Just didn't really seem right to most of us that were working the stuff at the time. The fact that individuals like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn have gone free when we know that they were involved in very heinous acts, and to this day are not repentant about those acts, I think bothers all of us.
And we're going to get from Larry Grathwohl himself some important information about the bomb-making activities of the Weather Underground. Now, it's important to note that the FBI officials who ended up being prosecuted and convicted of violating the rights of the terrorists were pardoned by President Reagan. Now, later, President Clinton would pardon some members of the Weather Underground who had been in prison. And then during the 2008 campaign, we learned that then candidate, now President Barack Obama, had a personal relationship that he tried to play down with Bill Ayers himself. And I know, Max, you started getting some attention at that time because obviously you weren't too happy with that.
No, I think that my problem at the time and my concern was that the mainstream media was not doing what I believed to be their job and properly vetting the relationship between then candidate Obama and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. And it also bothered me that the mainstream media has regularly portrayed the Weather Underground and other groups similar to them at that time as being cavalier young people who were protesting what they believed to be an illegal war in Asia, as opposed to being a domestic, terrorist, urban guerrilla group that was trying to overthrow, through the use of violence, the United States government. And they were guilty of killing people, as opposed to the image that they would like you to believe about them today.
And of course, all of this is relevant, ladies and gentlemen, today, because obviously President Obama is in office, and he appointed the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. And yet, if we're going to get justice for the victims of the Weather Underground and the families of the victims, such as Sergeant McDonnell, we're going to need the cooperation of local, state, and federal authorities to bring forth the evidence in that case and many others in particular. Now, think to yourself, would Eric Holder have any interest in bringing members of the Weather Underground to justice if they had a personal relationship with his boss, the President of the United States? That's why we're doing this series of videos. We're going to put on the record what we know about what these people did. And in the next installment of this series of videos, we're going to hear from Larry Grathwohl, who was an informant in the Weather Underground and participated in meetings with the likes of Bill Ayers. So stay with us. Keep watching these videos. We need your support. We need your help to bring justice in this and other cases. Hi, this is Cliff Kincaid, President of America Survival. We're continuing our look at the situation that existed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in this country, a time of bombings and revolutionary terrorism on American soil. My guests are Max Noel, a former FBI agent for 31 years who investigated the Weather Underground, and Larry Grathwohl, a former FBI informant inside the organization, who wrote this book about his experiences called Bringing America Down. This was his account of being inside this terrorist group. And of course, it's referred to in many occasions as a domestic terrorist group, but they had extensive foreign connections, getting support from foreign governments. And before we let Larry talk about his experiences, and in particular, the evidence he has about who carried out the Park Station bombing in San Francisco, killing Sergeant Brian V. McDonnell, who's pictured on the posters in back of me. There is a reward out for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrators of this homicide. This is still an open case, ladies and gentlemen, and we need your help. We need your support. Law enforcement authorities at the local, state, and federal level need your support. Tom Houston, who was a lawyer for President Nixon in 1969, saw this violence coming off the college campuses. Of course, the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, morphed into the Weatherman, or the Weather Underground terrorist organization. And he said in his report to the President, an eyes-only report, several intelligence officers in different agencies told me in the course of my study that they believe we are confronted with the most serious threat to our internal security in their lifetimes. And the greatest threat, he went on to say, is our blindness to the nature of what is occurring around us in the country today. Well, we're honored to have two patriots here, Max Noel and Larry Grathwohl, who did what they could to bring these terrorists to justice. And Larry, you've always been somebody who supported your country, you fought for your country, you're a Vietnam veteran, and then you volunteered to be an informant serving law enforcement inside the Weather Underground. Tell us about your motivation, how you got involved, and what you learned specifically in these meetings with these terrorists about the Park Station bombing.
Well, I'll begin by telling you that my first encounter with the Weathermen was by chance. I was a student at the University of Cincinnati, and they were recruiting people to go to what they called the National Action in Chicago, where they out attacked the Chicago Police Department. I went to the Cincinnati Police first, and then to the FBI, and ultimately became the only source of information that remained with the group when they went underground in 1969. During that time, after the group went underground, I participated in the planning for bombings at the 13th Precinct in the Detroit Police Officers Association building in Detroit, Michigan. Bill Ayers was in charge of that bombing, and he gave us the instructions to place the bombs at those places at the time that it would kill the greatest number of people. The bombs themselves were designed with fence nails, fence staples as shrapnel, and essentially used the same bombing design that was ultimately used at the Park Police Station. The bomb was even placed on the window ledge, the same as what happened at the Park Police Station. Those bombings actually took place, and fortunately for us and unfortunately for the Weathermen, the bombs failed to detonate. Later, I would meet up with Bill Ayers in Buffalo, New York, during which time he would criticize us for not being active enough, i.e. we weren't committing enough bombings. And he mentioned the fact that it was a real terrible situation when the leader, Bernardine Dorn, had to plan a bombing, build the bomb, and deliver the bomb, such as what had happened at the Park Police Station. Now, I testified to this in several grand juries and also before a Senate subcommittee, and I'd like to also take note of the fact that a young lady named Karen Latimer also testified before a grand jury substantiating what I said. And I understand that there's a couple of other witnesses who also have knowledge of this bombing. My point is that for an anti-war group, as Bill Ayers and Bernadine claim they were, they had made a plan, at least in two instances, the Detroit bombings and the Park Police Station bombing, that had one specific intent, and that was to kill policemen. I'm also aware of a bombing that was, or plan for a bombing of the Fort Dix, New Jersey enlisted men's club. Fortunately, in that instance, the bomb blew up and killed the Weatherman perpetrators. But again, dynamite, shrapnel, and shrapnel is only part of a bomb, is an anti-personnel effect. And the intent was to place those bombs at Fort Dix, New Jersey during this dance when husbands, wives, girlfriends would be present, and again, their intent was to kill as many people as possible, which again kind of belies their so-called anti-war movement. I can quote Bernadine Dorn, who said at the National Council meeting, "Bring the war home, kill your parents." She also at the National Council meeting praised Charles Manson and said, "Dig it, not only did they kill those pigs, but they sat down and ate their dinner, and then they shoved a fork in Sharon Tate's stomach."
Now let me, at that point, mention that this is one of the reasons we got involved in looking at the media coverage of the Weathermen when they resurfaced, so to speak, in the 2008 campaign because of their relationship with then candidate, now President Barack Obama. Many reporters were saying, well, they set off a few bombs, committed maybe some sabotage, but except for their three comrades who blew themselves up in that Greenwich Village apartment, they never killed anybody. And that's when we found your testimony. Your testimony has been on the record about Ayers and Dorn and Park Station. You've given that testimony under oath.
Yes.
And ladies and gentlemen, Larry's point is important to keep in mind. Yeah, this is a cold case, so to speak. That's what they call it. But it is still open. There is a task force called the Phoenix Task Force working between city and state authorities that is looking at Park Station and other cases. So this is still open. Justice can still be done. The perpetrators of this bombing can still be brought to justice. And I have to make the point, too, that when we began this project for justice for victims of Weather Underground terrorism, that the San Francisco Police Officers Association issued a letter, and I have it right here, in support of our efforts, blaming the Park Station bombing on Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn. So we believe all the evidence has to be gathered. We're not coming to any necessary conclusions right now, but we're going to go into more about Park Station. And also in this series of videos, we're going to be looking inside a Weather Underground bomb factory that Max Noel, then an FBI agent, was a part of a team that discovered in San Francisco. We'll show you what was in this bomb factory where Bill Ayers' fingerprints were found. So stay with us. We've got a series of videos on this important topic. Welcome back. My name's Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of the group America's Survival. We have a project called Justice for Victims of Weather Underground Terrorism. We're talking about this period of time in the United States in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when literally hundreds, if not thousands, of bombings were occurring on American soil, many of them carried out by the Weather Underground. But their leading members, some of them went to prison, but their leading members, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, basically got off and became, quote, professors in Chicago, and of course associates of the current president of the United States. And FBI officials were actually prosecuted for violating their rights. But in particular, we're talking about one unsolved case, over 40 years old, that of the bombing murder of San Francisco Police Sergeant Brian V. McDonald. And Max, I know you're here because you want to see justice in this case. You were an FBI investigator, a member of the Weatherman Task Force. You followed these people around. You know that this case is open. You know, without asking you to be critical of what they're doing or not doing, what do you think could be done to solve this case?
Well, I've always believed that you can't continue to look at a case the same way over a number of years. As a member of the Unabomb Task Force, which was of long duration, a similar case, not quite as long, but of a long duration, it just didn't seem to me appropriate to continue to look at the case the same way as the original investigators had looked at it back in the mid to late 1970s. They were competent, capable investigators, and for us to be presumptuous enough to think that we could look at the same things in the same ways that they did and come to different conclusions just didn't seem right to me. So I think that anyone looking at this case needs to take a different approach. I'm not quite sure. I don't know what they've done and how they've done it, but you need to always look at something differently, both forensically and as well as the way that you investigate it in an attempt to solve it.
Do you think all the evidence about the Park Station bombing in particular has been gotten out of the FBI itself? Could there be more information or evidence in the Bureau's offices?
I don't believe so on the Park Station bombing. I don't believe the FBI ever had any jurisdiction on the Park Station bombing itself. But there were a number of bombings going on, similar bombings, in the Bay Area at that particular time. And I know that when we start talking about the Pine Street apartment, that the bomb-making tools that were used in the Pine Street apartment were forensically compared to by the FBI laboratory, and the conclusion was that at least one of them, if not more than one of them, the conclusion was that those tools built those bombs. So to continue just to look at the bomb debris of the Park Station, in my estimation, would be sure, apply new techniques to it that are available to us and so on and so forth, but maybe do comparisons of other bombings. The bombing of the Clay Street Armed Forces Police Station, the bombing out of the Presidio, and various other bombings. There were lots of bombings going on in the Bay Area at that time, many of which the Weather Underground took credit for.
Now, we're going to look at what you discovered in the Pine Street bomb factory in San Francisco. But let me ask you about what more can be done in terms of evidence gathering. You're saying primarily look at the case in a different light, compare it to some of the other bombings. I noticed in the FBI massive file on the Weather Underground that's up on the FBI website that they list a whole number of Weather Underground bombings that the group claimed credit for.
Correct.
But the Weather Underground never claimed credit for Park Station. Why?
Well, I'm not clairvoyant, and I don't know why they wouldn't take credit for something they did, but I would suspect that the reason that they didn't was because they killed an individual, and that the punishment for murder was much more severe than it was for committing acts of sabotage, as they like to say. So they were very eager to take credit for these acts of sabotage in which no one was injured, because that was the propaganda that they were putting out at the time. But when they went so far as to kill a police officer, they weren't real eager, I don't believe, to come into the public spotlight and compromise public opinion compromise their reputations in public opinion. They believe big. The Weather Underground went to a number of foreign countries for indoctrination by different officials, and one of their big things that they accomplished and that was stressed in a lot of those training sessions was the use of propaganda. And killing a police officer wasn't going to be to their benefit, I don't believe.
I think there's another factor too, and it's that Bernadine Dorn was the perpetrator of the bombing at the Park Police Station. She was the nominal high priestess or chief of the Weather Underground at that time. So to take credit for it, and her having been the active participant, would have put at risk their number one person. It would be like putting at risk Fidel Castro or Chairman Mao.
And of course, we're going to have to make it clear that she was allegedly responsible based on your testimony, based on discussing this with Bill Ayers himself. But on the other hand, Dorn was so outspoken about other things, praising the Charles Manson gang, a group of psychopaths.
Yes.
Both Ayers and Dorn had issued, and talk about this, the Prairie Fire Manifesto that included a dedication to Sirhan Sirhan, the assassin of Robert F. Kennedy.
Now, isn't that interesting that this is an anti-war group, as they portray themselves today, who are dedicating their manifesto, Prairie Fire, to Sirhan Sirhan, who killed Robert Kennedy, the biggest anti-war candidate in 1968. Not only that, Prairie Fire says that it's a declaration of war on the United States, and it's signed by Bernadine Dorn, Bill Ayers, and Jeff Jones. And yes, it's alleged that she placed the bomb at the Park Police Station, but keep in mind that 3 other people that I'm aware of in sworn testimony or in statements to the FBI have corroborated what Bill Ayers told me about her participation.
And ladies and gentlemen, there may be somebody out in this viewing audience watching this. This is one in a series of videos on this subject who might have some information that is relevant to solving this case and bringing the perpetrators to justice. One of the posters behind me is from the San Francisco Police Department, and they are actually offering a reward for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrators of the Park Police Station bombing. So the case is still open. There's a task force of local and state officials still investigating this case. There may be somebody out there watching this right now who has some information. Please come forward. Contact us, contact the San Francisco Police Department directly. When we get back, and this is just one in a series of videos, we're going to go into what Max has referred to several times, the Pine Street bomb factory that was discovered by the FBI in San Francisco. Bill Ayers' fingerprints were found in this bomb factory. We are going to show you pictures of the bomb-making equipment as well as the communist propaganda. It was almost like a communist bookstore at Pine Street. So stay with us and help us, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of the public policy group America's Survival. We have an ongoing project called Justice for Victims of Weather Underground Terrorism. We've held conferences on this subject in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. We're recording this series of videos in San Francisco on 9/11. We're looking back at a period of revolutionary violence and terrorism on American soil in the 60s, 70s, and 80s involving characters and notables such as Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, who of course became even more infamous or notorious during the 2008 campaign because of their association with the President of the United States. Our guests are Max Noel, a retired FBI agent. He served the Bureau for 31 years. He was a member of the Weatherman Task Force. He investigated these people. We're going to talk about the Weather Underground bomb factory that he helped locate in San Francisco. My other guest, Larry Grathwohl, former FBI informant in the Weather Underground, who wrote this book about his experiences inside the Weather Underground called Bringing Down America. Larry, I want to follow up on your testimony. You've mentioned that you testified under oath before grand juries, the congressional committees, about Bill Ayers telling you at one point, why did Bernardine Dohrn have to plant that bomb at Park Station, the bomb that killed Sergeant McDonald, a young officer. And talk about him and what the reaction has been to your testimony, the evidence you've provided, because he was a young officer. Tell us about the nature of that bomb and the suffering that we all know he went through.
Well, the bomb itself was designed the same way the one to be used in Detroit at the 13th Precinct was designed. At the 13th Precinct, they used 34 sticks of dynamite wrapped with fence staples, and the bomb was placed on the window ledge. The fence staples were there for the purpose of shrapnel, anti-personnel effect. The idea was to kill and injure people. Bill Ayers designed that bomb. He sat at a kitchen table and showed me and two other people how that bomb was to be put together. The other bomb was to be placed at the 13th Precinct, and when I protested that explosion was going to kill more people in the restaurant next door, Bill Ayers' response was, well, sometimes innocent people have to die in a revolution. I suppose that's true as long as you're not one of the people dying. I understand that when the bomb exploded at the Park Police Station, a fence staple was driven into Brian McDonald's eye and went into his brain, and that he laid in the hospital for 2 or 3 days before he finally passed away. So this man suffered considerably before he died. When Bill Ayers told me about Bernardine Dohrn's participation in the Park Police Station bombing, it was as part of a criticism session of me and several other people in Buffalo, New York, because we hadn't placed any bombs and hadn't been active like Bernardine had been out here in San Francisco. Today, Bill Ayers denies that he ever said that to me. He calls me a liar. But again, I would emphasize the fact that I've testified before 3 grand juries, federal grand juries, and 1 Senate subcommittee under oath. Bill Ayers hasn't. Bernardine Dohrn, when she was asked about my testimony and the accusation that she placed the bomb at the Park Police Station, she wouldn't even respond to it. She just basically said Larry Grathwohl is a pig infiltrator, and that's all she would say. She wouldn't deny that she had placed the bomb or admit that she placed the bomb.
Now, let's talk about this. This is in your book. This is when the Weather Underground put out a wanted poster on you.
Yes.
Tell us about that and the circumstances under which you came out.
Well, my cover was blown in April of 1970. The FBI wanted to arrest one of the Weatherman fugitives. Her name was Linda Evans. So we arranged for her to be arrested along with myself at a meeting that was taking place in Greenwich Village on April the 15th, 1970. There was also another young lady named Diane Dongi who was arrested the same day. When I told the FBI that when that happened that my cover would be blown, that the Weathermen would never trust me again. And I was right, but regardless, we tried to save my cover by arresting me too for assaulting a federal officer. After that, I began working with the Bureau on surveillances and at different demonstrations in the hopes that I would be able to identify the fugitives, the Weathermen fugitives. And 2 FBI agents working in Berkeley, California found that wanted poster hanging in I believe it was a dock down on the Berkeley docks. And as you can see, it's a regular wanted poster. It says wanted for crimes against the people. And it says that I should be stamped out like a snake or venomous snake or something like that.
Now, one of the interesting things to me as a journalist is, and I don't have the experience of any criminal investigators, but I remember when we started our project for the victims of Weather Underground terrorism, we had come out to San Francisco to hold a news conference, and we followed around Ayers and Dorn's former, or actually current comrade, Mark Rudd.
Yes.
Another leading member of the Weather Underground.
One of the founders.
And he had written a book, amazingly enough. He got a big advance from News Corporation to write a book about his experiences, and whether we can trust what he says or not. We put a question to him during one of those public appearances he made about whether he had ever been contacted by law enforcement authorities about Park Station, about the bombing
Correct.
of Park Station, February 16th, 1970. And you remember he said he had never been contacted, or his lawyer had never been contacted, and he didn't know anything about it.
Right.
Well, do you believe that or not?
No. No. And as a matter of fact, Mark Rudd, in his book, acknowledges the fact that Terry Robbins told him about the Fort Dix, New Jersey bombing that was being planned by Diana Otten, Terry Robbins, and Ted Gold, who died in the townhouse explosion, and that he assented to it or approved it. But he basically, where the Park Police Station bombing is concerned, denies any knowledge and will not talk about Bernadine's part in it. He claims that she's his sister.
That's right.
That's what he said.
And this is the amazing thing to me. Maybe they wouldn't get anything out of Rudd. Maybe his lawyer would stonewall. Maybe he just wouldn't say anything. Maybe he doesn't know anything about Park Station. But it is a fact that, as you say in his book, he admits assenting or approving the plan to bomb Fort Dix, where officers and their wives and dates, literally hundreds of people, were going to be. He approved that bombing, and of course it exploded prematurely, killing 3 of their comrades.
And they don't know how much explosive was in that building. They found unexploded bombs in addition to the ones that went off. So obviously this was no small undertaking for them. They intended to do a lot of damage at Fort Dix.
I mean, these were vicious, violent terrorists, ladies and gentlemen, and yet most of them are free today. Many went on to become college professors and teachers, and FBI officials instead were prosecuted for violating their rights. But justice can still be done. We need your support. If you can help solve the case of the Park Station bombing, contact us, America Survival, or contact the San Francisco Police Department. The case is open. There is a task force called the Phoenix Task Force actively investigating this case now. When we get back, we're going to take you inside the Pine Street Weather Underground bomb factory discovered in San Francisco. Hi, welcome back. My name's Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of a group called America's Survival. We have established a project for justice for victims of weather underground terrorism. My guests are Max Noel, retired FBI agent, served 31 years in the Bureau. He was a member of the Weatherman Task Force in San Francisco and worked all kinds of other high-profile cases, including the Unabomber case of Theodore Kaczynski, who carried on terror bombings for 18 years. My other guest, Larry Grathwohl, Vietnam veteran, former FBI informant in the Weather Underground, wrote a book, Bringing Down America, and continues to speak out against the terrorists in the Weather Underground who have now become, quote, respectable figures and even associates of the President of the United States. Max, tell us about the Pine Street bomb factory that was discovered in San Francisco. We have a big poster here, which is of an FBI document posted by the FBI on its own website, which gives a little bit about the fingerprints that were found in this bomb factory, including Bill Ayers, Kathy Bodine, David Gilbert. Bodine and Gilbert later went to prison for their involvement in the Brinks armored car robbery that cost the lives of 2 police officers and a security guard. And Mark Rudd, his fingerprints are in this Weather Underground bomb factory, and we previously talked about the fact that he approved the bomb that was supposed to destroy Fort Dix, an officers' club dance, killing hundreds of people, but instead killed 3 of his comrades. Tell us about the bomb factory and what you found there.
Well, after the Greenwich Village bomb factory in New York blew up, killing 3 of the Weather Underground members, the FBI became aware through investigation in Chicago and New York that many of the Weather Underground members had fled both New York and Chicago and were in early 1971 in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. So the special agent in charge of the FBI office at that particular time was a gentleman named Robert Gephardt. And Mr. Gephardt declared an office special, which meant that everyone in the San Francisco division of the office of the FBI was available for work on this office special. And we began a very covert investigation in an attempt to locate, determine who these weathermen were that were here, identify them, locate them, and hopefully arrest them. And during the course of that investigation, several of us became aware of an apartment on Pine Street. It was located at 1038A Pine Street, in which a Weatherman bomb factory was discovered by those of us that searched it.
And we're going to include in this video pictures of what was discovered in that bomb factory, and I was amazed to see these photos. Tell us what was there.
Well, the landlord came to us with his concern because the occupants of the apartment seemed to have abandoned the apartment, and he had let himself in to see if they were in fact gone, and he saw what he thought to be some disturbing things, like what he described to be electrical things and tools, and he was concerned over it. And he had an agent's card who had been around that neighborhood doing some investigation, and he called our office, and that agent, along with myself, Byron Walk, John Reichs, and Dennis Ruffin, responded to the scene, and he allowed us to go into the apartment. The first thing that was very apparent to us was the apartment had been left in a big hurry. The occupants had left a lot of personal things there, including watches and rings on sinks and so forth. They had burned something on the stove. The charred remains were still on the gas stove.
A document of some kind?
Something, yes, something, paper. They were too charred and too burned to reconstruct. Our laboratory couldn't tell us what they were. And lots of what the landlord had described to us, which we recognized immediately as bomb-making equipment and bomb-making tools. And we immediately contacted our counterparts in the San Francisco Police Department, and 2 members of their bomb unit responded, Donnie Hansen and Russ Algram, and we proceeded to search the apartment, finding lots of bomb-making materials, including a large block of C4 plastic explosives, pipes for making pipe bombs, switches, assemblies, wires, fusing to a fuse, on and on and on. I mean, it was just amazing.
Tell us about this voice-activated bomb material you found.
There was a switch in there for activating a bomb, which was initiated by voice activation, by noise, which is kind of counter to the claims now many years later of the Weather Underground people like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn that they never intended to hurt anyone. Well, if you're using a voice-activated switch, it would seem to me that probably someone had to be within close proximity of the bomb to activate that bomb through.
Now explain
the
how
voice.
that's going to work. A bomb like that is set in a room, and then people come in, there's noise, and boom.
And it would go off. It would complete the circuit somewhere. I'm not a bomb expert, and I was very pleased when Donnie Hansen and Russ Algram appeared on scene, because that's not my forte, and they were very competent and capable people. But not only did we find the bomb-making equipment, we also found several pairs of latex gloves, which upon examination by our laboratory showed that there was explosive residue on those gloves, which would lead me to believe then someone was building bombs wearing those gloves so that they didn't leave fingerprints. That was kind of characteristic of a lot of the Weather Underground bombing. There were no fingerprints on them, and now we know that there were latex gloves that were involved. We found disguise kits. Lots of wigs, lots of hair dye, lots of things to disguise your identity, and so forth. And then this just overwhelming amount of communist, Marxist, Leninist literature, from everyone from Engels to Marx to Mao to Che Guevara to Fidel Castro and so forth. And from my perspective now, it's very almost to the point of being humorous to me. The one thing that we didn't find in that apartment, with all of this vast amount of things that we did find, was anything pertaining to the anti-war movement. Even though the normal media, the mainstream media, will tell you today that the Weathermen were there for anti-war, protesting this illegal war in Southeast Asia, blah, 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 and that they never intended to hurt anyone. Well, all we found was Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Cuban literature and propaganda, and bomb-making equipment and tools.
And of course, a voice-activated device, a voice-activated bomb, is an anti-personnel weapon. And as Larry has told us, Bill Ayers specialized in that. And according to Ayers himself, as reported by Larry, Bernardine Dorn planted the anti-personnel bomb on the ledge at Park Station that killed Sergeant McDonnell after 2 agonizing days of suffering in the hospital. That bomb was packed full of heavy metal staples. This was clearly an anti-personnel weapon designed to kill people. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue our discussion of the Weather Underground, so stay with us. This is one in a series of videos on this important subject, and we reiterate that the Park Station bombing case is still open. The authorities need your help. There may be someone watching this video who can help, who has some evidence or testimony that could help bring the perpetrators in the Weather Underground to justice for that homicide. This is Cliff Kincaid. We'll be back. Hi, welcome back. My name's Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of America's Survival. We have a project for justice for victims of weather underground terrorism. We're talking about that period of time with Max Noel, retired FBI agent, a former member of the Weatherman Task Force in San Francisco. He investigated these people. He was in the Bureau for 31 years. And Larry Grathwohl, a former FBI informant in the weather underground, who has written a book, Bringing Down America, about what he learned about the weather underground when he was inside the organization. We've been talking about their bomb-making abilities, in particular the bomb factory that Max and his fellow agents discovered in San Francisco. And Max, you've been talking about the bomb-making equipment, the communist literature, and we are putting up photos, ladies and gentlemen, of this, of the material, the bomb-making equipment, and the extensive Marxist-Leninist propaganda. It was almost like a bookstore in there. I don't know how they had time to read all this stuff while they were making their bombs. Maybe that inspired them. They were certainly true believers to have all this stuff, things like Stalin reports, women and communism, the struggle against imperialist war, but in particular the anti-personnel weapons and the devices or things they were constructing to kill people. What about that stabbing device?
Well, we were very surprised to find a cache of what at first glance appeared to be ballpoint pens, black ballpoint pens, the type of a pen. It's not a retractable pen, but it's a pen that has a top to it, and you take the top off and you write with it. And when we took the top off of these black pens, of which there were a number, we were very surprised, because inside that black pen was, instead of a pen filler, was what appeared to be a knitting needle, which had been epoxy resined into the body of the pen itself, and then the head of the knitting needle had been filed down, ground down, honed down to a very sharp point, and then it was tempered in fire. You could tell that they'd been fired, and it was tempered in fire, and there's no other use for those than as an anti-personnel device. You stab someone with it, and it was a method back then. This is pre-magnetometer area, pre-magnetometer at airports and at police departments and at courtrooms and what have you. It was a method of getting through security with a device that could be used to kill someone. There's no other explanation for that. So contrary, again, to Mr. Ayers or Ms. Dorn and various other members of the Weather Underground who now want to characterize themselves as only committing acts of sabotage, you don't bring a building down with a stabbing instrument.
And of course, this is a copy of the FBI document about whose fingerprints were found in the Pine Street factory, and Bill Ayers' fingerprints were there, along with Mark Rudd, another infamous leader of the Weather Underground, who basically got off and became a teacher in New Mexico. Larry and I followed Mark Rudd around when he was promoting his book, which has some honest parts to it, among them admitting that he approved the Fort Dix bomb, which was designed to kill officers and their wives and dates, but went off prematurely, killing 3 members of the Weather Underground. And I want to ask you, Max, before we go to Larry for further thoughts on this whole subject, and I wrote about this at the time. I was amazed, but I can hardly imagine what your response would be. Not only does Rudd basically get off and escape justice, and he has not been called in connection with the Park Police Station bombing, but he gets invited to the FBI Academy to teach what?
He lectured at the FBI Academy on conflict resolution. Mark Rudd is a mathematics teacher. And I was very perplexed and disgusted to learn that the staff of the FBI Academy brought Mark Rudd back there to teach conflict resolution, a man who seemed to think the way that conflicts were resolved was by violence and bombings, to the FBI Academy to speak with groups of police officers and young agents about how to resolve conflict. It just is beyond anything that I could ever imagine.
Did you ever get a satisfactory explanation for why this happened?
No. I approached Assistant Director John Pistole at a conference of retired FBI agents 2 years ago and brought it to his attention. He very genuinely said he was not aware that that had occurred and that he would look into it, and that's the last I ever heard of it. The more troubling part of that, from my perspective and from former agents' perspective, is that Mark Red posted on his website or blog, I'm not quite sure, I went up and read about this, this is where I saw it, his involvement, and he had a caveat at the end of this posting in which he told his supporters not to be concerned and not think he'd gone over to the other side because he was teaching at the FBI Academy, but he promised to all of his supporters that any money or pay that he got as a result of teaching at the FBI Academy in the future, he would donate to the Free Leonard Peltier Fund. If you want to get under the skin of former FBI agents, you start talking about a fund to free Leonard Peltier.
And what did Peltier do?
Peltier murdered 2 FBI agents on the reservation at Wounded Knee back in the early 1970s.
Now, in talking about what was found in this bomb factory, Mark Rudd's fingerprints were there. You've mentioned a lot of things, including the latex gloves they used. And Larry, we were talking off camera, something occurred to you that maybe some of these materials, if they could still be found, and they must be available somewhere, could provide some good leads to Park Station.
Well, I would assume that this evidence is still in existence someplace. And I asked Max if it would be possible to lift fingerprints from the inside of these latex gloves, and he said yes. So, you know, the forensics has improved considerably over the last 20 or 30 years, and it would be possible now to find out who was wearing those gloves and who made the bombs. Also, Max pointed out that maybe the impressions of the latex gloves themselves could be found on some of the bomb components, such as the one at the SF police station that was found in the drainage in the women's room that they found intact.
And did I understand you to say earlier, Max, that analyzing some of these bomb-making materials could provide leads to Park Station?
Oh, I would think so. I don't know what the Phoenix Task Force has done. I don't know the availability of the evidence and what have you. But I know from having conducted a in-depth investigation of the Unabomb investigation, in which we had bombs that were 17 years old, that we applied new forensic techniques that are available today that weren't necessarily available at the time of the bombing. And among those things are, as Larry suggests, much better methods of developing latent fingerprints from different types of surfaces, much better techniques of identifying explosive residues that are left, for instance, on the latex gloves that might have come from bombs. If you have those materials available to you, there's a lot of different techniques that can be utilized.
And Max, and both Larry and Max have testified to the fact that these people, the Weather Underground, they were true believers. They were communists. That's why they had all this Marxist-Leninist literature. Mark Rudd is still a true believer. Ayers and Dorn are still true believers in the communist or worldwide communist revolution. But the good news is that some of these people may still be brought to justice, and that's why we're having this series of videos, and we need your help. The Phoenix Task Force is open, consisting of state and local authorities investigating Park Station and other matters. So we're going to continue to press for justice for the victims of Weather Underground terrorism, especially, most notably, Sergeant Brian McDonald. We'll be back. Hi, welcome back. My name's Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of the group America's Survival. We're talking about the Weather Underground and the period of revolutionary violence and terrorism that hit the United States back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we have not been able to cover every unsolved or cold case involving the Weather Underground or its spin-off groups in this series of videos. But please go to our website, usasurvival.org, for more documents and more information about the Park Station bombing case and others. And another factor that we want to get into somewhat is that the Weather Underground worked hand in glove with other groups, including a group known as the Black Liberation Army. And let me mention that in that case, the Weather Underground, this is clearly the case, it's been documented and verified, the Weather Underground helped a woman named Joanne Chesimard, also known as Assata Shakur, a member of the Black Liberation Army, escape from prison where she was serving a life term for killing a New Jersey state trooper, Warner Forster. The Weather Underground helped get her out of prison, and she is today living in communist Cuba. So this is another case where, and in the poster in back of me, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see a wanted poster for Joanne Chesimard, a wanted poster that the FBI just updated for somebody named Leo Burt. He was a member of sort of a Weather Underground affiliated or spin-off group, wanted in connection, still at large, still free, wanted in connection with the bombing of the University of Wisconsin, a bombing that killed a civilian, an innocent person. So there are other cases like this outstanding. We focused a lot today on the Park Station bombing case. But there are others out there that need your support. Perhaps you have some input or have some information that may help locate some of these fugitives that are still on the loose. And Max, you know a lot about how the Weather Underground worked with groups like the BLA. Tell us about that.
Well, I think one of the things that's been glossed over over the years, is the Weather Underground's close ties with the various Black liberation groups, including the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the Black Guerrilla Family, the Republic of New Africa, and I mean, you go on and name several others. They were all closely aligned, and if anyone takes the time to read the writings and the speeches of Bernardine Dorn and other leaders of the Weather Underground at the time, you'll see that they were very much into the Black liberation movement and aligned themselves with them. And several of these black groups, including the Black Liberation Army, were much more violent than some of the more theoretical groups like the Black Panther Party. They were adjuncts to the Black Panther Party for carrying out the theory and the rhetoric that the Black Panthers were espousing. And as an example of that, in August of 1971, they attacked, 8 of them attacked the Ingleside police station in San Francisco and killed Sergeant Victor Young, wounding another civilian clerical employee of the police department. And a member of the Weather Underground, Marilyn Buck, was identified in a photo lineup by one of the police officers as being a woman who came to the station shortly before the attack took place and cased it, if you will, for the 8 individuals who showed up and tried to blow their way into the station house. So the Weathermen utilized the talents of these black liberation groups to their benefit to carry out lots of acts of violence also.
And Buck was also involved in the escape from prison of Joanne Chesimard.
Yes.
She served time in prison. She's one of the Weather Underground members that did go to prison.
Yes.
Some time was given to her for her involvement in the bombing of the U.S. Capitol. That was one in a series of bombings that these people committed. Just an amazing list of bombings, but she was a key person, it seems, between the Weather Underground and the BLA. And so the question always persists. Look, these people haven't gone away. They're still committed communists. We know Ayers and Dorn go down to Venezuela under the control of Marxist Hugo Chavez. They're the boy they raised, the product of Kathy Bodine and David Gilbert, who went to prison for the murder of 2 police officers and a security guard in the Nyack, New York robbery attempt. Chesa Boudin, they raised him. He used to work for Hugo Chavez. So, you know, a red diaper baby, in other words. We know Ayers and Dorn have been meeting recently, and we're going to have some information on our website about this. They've been meeting recently with members, former members of the Red Army faction in Germany. This is a group that's probably even more violent, was even more violent than the Weather Underground. The Red Army faction killed members of the U.S. military and bombed U.S. military bases. And of course, Larry, you were in the midst of this. You were with these people. You know what they think. What is their plan? They haven't given up.
No. And the plan ultimately was to overthrow the government and to replace it with a communist, or what they referred to as a democratic centralist government, which is essentially the same type of government that they now have in Cuba. By the way, they had very strong ties with the Cubans. They went down there and met with the North Vietnamese and with the Chinese. Anyway, their intent was to overthrow the government. And when they accomplished this, they saw themselves as being the leaders, and they were going to establish re-education centers in the Southwest, where people who could not adapt to the new order would be sent to be re-educated. Now, they estimated that that would be about 100 million people. I want you to think about that. 100 million people. That's about half the population of the United States back then, or maybe a little less. Of that 100 million, they estimated that 25 million would not be able to be re-educated into the new order and would have to be eliminated. That's murdered, okay? That's what they meant by eliminated. Now, I sat in meetings with people who went to Columbia University, Michigan State, who had master's degrees and PhDs, who discussed the logistics of how they were going to eliminate 25 million people, and they were serious. This is along the same lines of Bernardine Dorn praising Charles Manson and the fact that they were going to that they sat in that room and ate their dinner and then shoved a fork in Sharon Tate's stomach. I mean, it's absolutely brutal. And I want you to imagine today Bill Ayers standing on the American flag, proudly displaying himself with a big smile on his face, and the caption reads, "Guilty as hell, free as a bird, isn't America wonderful?"
And ladies and gentlemen, these terrorists are still committed Marxist-Leninists. They haven't given up. The survival of the United States is still at stake. We not only face them, the communist revolutionaries, but now the Islamic revolutionaries, the Islamists, the Islamic fanatics. We're recording these videos on 9/11, and we're focused on the threat from radical Islam, but we still face a threat from the Weather Underground. You can fight back by helping us get justice for the victims of Weather Underground terrorism, such as Sergeant Brian V. McDonald. 40 years ago, a bomb exploded on the ledge of Park Station in San Francisco, packed with heavy metal staples. He suffered in the hospital for 2 days before dying. This case can be solved. Help us, help the San Francisco police, help the local and state authorities close this case and bring the perpetrators, bring members of the Weather Underground to justice for what they did for this homicide. Thank you. after it occurred on February 16, 1970. Now, my guests today include Max Noel, who was an FBI agent, highly decorated for 31 years. He was a criminal investigator in the San Francisco division of the FBI, working on several high-profile FBI investigations and cases. He was also a member and supervisor of the Unabomb task force that arrested Unabomber Theodore Kaczynski after his 18-year spree of terrorist bombings. Max Noel also investigated the Weather Underground. He was a member of the Weatherman Task Force in San Francisco and helped locate the Pine Street bomb factory maintained by the Weather Underground. We're going to talk about that bomb factory in one of our videos. That is a bomb factory where the fingerprints of leading members of the Weather Underground, including Bill Ayers, were found. We are going to take you inside that bomb factory, showing you pictures of the bomb-making materials and communist Marxist-Leninist literature that were found there. Max, when we look back at this period of time, explain from your perspective as an FBI agent at the time what you were looking at, what you were facing.
Well, FBI...
President Reagan. Now, later, President Clinton would pardon some members of the Weather Underground who had been in prison. And then during the 2008 campaign, we learned that then candidate, now President Barack Obama, had a personal relationship that he tried to play down with Bill Ayers himself. And I know, Max, you started getting some attention at that time because obviously you weren't too happy with that.
No, I think that my problem at the time and my concern was that the mainstream media was not doing what I believed to be their job in properly vetting the relationship between then candidate Obama and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. And it also bothered me that the mainstream media has regularly portrayed the Weather Underground and other groups similar to them at that time as being cavalier young people who were protesting what they believed to be an illegal war in Asia, as opposed to being a domestic, terrorist, urban guerrilla group that was trying to overthrow, through the use of violence, the United States government. And they were guilty of killing people, as opposed to the image that they would like you to believe about them today.
And of course, all of this is relevant, ladies and gentlemen, today, because obviously President Obama is in office, and he appointed the Attorney General of the United States, Eric. Hi, my name is Cliff Kincaid. I'm president of the public policy group, America's Survival. We examine terrorism and related issues. I'm joined today by Max Noel, a former FBI agent for 31 years, and Larry Grathwohl, a former FBI informant. On this day, 9/11, we're coming to you from San Francisco to discuss a wave of terrorism that occurred decades ago. It was a period of terrorism and revolutionary violence on American soil back in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. This included literally hundreds of bombings and attacks on police that took the lives of police officers. And one of these cases in particular we're going to get into in some detail, and that involved the murder of San Francisco Police Sergeant Brian V. McDonald, which remains officially unsolved 40 years. Members of the Weather Underground, many of them basically got off. Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn not only went free, but they became, quote, respected college professors And yet top officials of the FBI ended up being prosecuted for violating their rights.
Well, I think that's always bothered all of us over the years. For them to have been freed on what most of us consider to be technicalities, most FBI agents that worked in that time, I don't believe, thought it was correct. The fact that 3 of our leaders were convicted of crimes for the actions that they were authorizing just didn't really seem right to most of us that were working the stuff at the time. The fact that individuals like Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn have gone free when we know that they were involved in very heinous acts, and to this day are not repentant about those acts, I think bothers all of us.
And we're going to get from Larry Grathwohl himself some important information about the bomb-making activities of the Weather Underground. Now, it's important to note that the FBI officials who ended up being prosecuted and convicted of violating the rights of the terrorists were pardoned by...
Didn't interrupt their normal investigative activities because of the large amount of what I would consider to be urban guerrilla warfare going on, but it certainly was a distraction as a young agent working. And people today have tended to forget what a dangerous time the late 60s and the early 70s in particular were for law enforcement officials, specifically local law enforcement officials. In 1972, for instance, there were over 1,900 bombings domestically in the United States. In 1971, there were all kinds of bombings and attacks on police officers, police stations, government buildings, and so forth. So, being a young agent at that time in San Francisco, who was spending most of his time, or a good deal of his time, working in the Haight-Ashbury and in amongst the counterculture people, we were very aware of the dangers involved for local law enforcement, and that's why the killing, the bombing at the Park Police Station was very near and dear to me as an FBI agent. I was in the Parks Police Station frequently during that particular period of time.
And that's the bombing that took the life of Sergeant McDonald. Now, looking back on it as a former agent at that time, what's your reaction to the fact that